Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Cotter, a policy analyst with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. We want to thank you all for joining our webinar entitled "The Kids Are Not All Right: How Border Policies Continue to Separate Families and Put Children in Harm's Way." Just for everyone's knowledge, today's conversation is being recorded, and we are also utilizing auto captioning for Zoom. And then we've also reserved time at the end for questions. As he ran for president, then candidate Joe Biden forcefully criticized Donald Trump's unrelenting assault on our values and our history as a nation of immigrants, and promised that the cruelty, quote, stops when he is elected president. Moreover, Biden promised to modernize our immigration system and reassert America's commitment to asylum seekers and refugees. Despite that soaring language, 8 months into the Biden presidency, little has changed in our response to vulnerable immigrant children and families seeking safety in the United States. Most notably, the border remains closed to asylum seekers under a policy known as Title 42. Under Title 42, asylum seekers are prohibited from entering the United States to seek protection based on the idea that these asylum seekers present a threat to public health that is different from all other individuals. Instead, they are expelled by border agents who either push them back into Mexico without a hearing or who detain them without a hearing until they can be put onto planes to their home countries. In short, people are being sent to the exact dangers that they fled without any opportunity to ask for help, which is their right under US law. The policy was the linchpin of the prior administration's anti-immigrant campaign. For 3 years, the Trump administration tried to deter lawful immigration by creating barriers for asylum seekers at the US border. But neither former President Trump nor Stephen Miller could close the border entirely. It was the pandemic that created the opportunity, beginning in March of last year, that the administration announced that it was using a public health law, Title 42, to prevent asylum seekers from entering the country. Public health officials immediately and forcefully pushed back, but no one listened to the scientists. And that's because the policy has never been about public health. It's always been about stopping lawful migration. Beginning in last year, advocacy groups sued to ensure that the unaccompanied children, and these are children without a parent or legal guardian, were not subjected to the policy and could enter the country. A federal court agreed, and President Trump was forced to admit these unaccompanied kids, but the border remained closed to everyone else. Since the earliest days of his administration, immigration advocates and public health officials have called on President Biden to end Title 42 for everyone. And while the Biden administration has exempted unaccompanied children from Title 42 expulsions, it's continued to expel both families and single adults under the policy. The impact on children has been significant, as families nearing the border have been forced to choose between the horrors of separating in hopes that their children will be taken in as asylees or being sent back as a family to the dangerous conditions they fled from. The Biden administration has also fallen woefully short of its campaign promise to move away from detention and towards a system that welcomes migrants. Most notably, the administration has yet to articulate a strategy for closing and ending reliance on unlicensed emergency facilities for unaccompanied children, and has recently begun plans to reopen the roundly condemned Berks Detention Center as a prison for immigrant women. And recent images depicting abuse of Haitian asylum seekers by Border Patrol agents have shocked the conscience and have further amplified the anti-Blackness that permeates throughout our immigration system. So at today's webinar, we have speakers who will address these policies and their impact on children. And we will conclude by offering some recommendations for changing immigration policy to treat children fairly, with dignity, and in accordance with the law. So joining us for today's discussion, we have advocates engaged with individuals at the border and policy experts challenging policy through both lawsuits and other advocacy. Joining us for today's webinar, we have Adriana Zambrano of Aldea, the People's Justice Center, and Jane Liu, a senior litigation attorney with the Young Center. So I want to begin first with Adriana, an area where the Biden administration has clearly fallen short of its rhetoric is in regards to its promise to move our immigration system beyond a detention paradigm. So Adriana is the program coordinator at Aldea, the People's Justice Center. The mission of Aldea is to provide a holistic approach to meeting the multifaceted needs of immigrant community members, including through legal, social, educational, and medical services. In addition to her work at Aldea, Adriana is a graduate of Michigan State Law School and Florida International University. She's worked with groups including the CARE Pro Bono Project and the Urban Justice Center. So Adriana, can you tell us what Aldea has seen from the Biden administration in terms of its reliance on detention and how their actions have deviated from what we would expect from an administration promising to be progressive on immigration?
Of course, Robert, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. And it's truly shocking. We feel very much deceived and devastated. And actually, it's not very shocking to just see another campaign promise broken. While in the very early days of the Biden administration, we saw positive movements towards decreasing reliance on detention. We saw the closure of Berks, of York, and other deeply problematic facilities. We saw really significant momentum to end the use of for-profit detention, including for undocumented immigrants. And now all we see is, like I said, another broken campaign promise. Instead, what we're seeing is our phone blowing up every single day with calls from primarily Nicaraguans from all over the country, from Livingston, Texas, from Otero, from Louisiana. And what they tell us is that they have been detained for weeks and months with no end in sight. And that's one of the many cruel things about detention, right? That you never really know when it's going to end. People with extremely viable asylum claims who are supposed to be on an expedited proceeding to be able to assert their rights as asylum seekers. But ICE is neglectfully, and I suspect truly intentionally and punitively, have not referred their cases to the asylum office for consideration. And these unreasonable and frankly inexcusable delays are causing people to be detained for months before they can get a credible fear interview or a hearing before a judge. And what we're seeing here in PA is devastating. What we're seeing is that the administration is trying to kind of make up for all these closed facilities in the Northeast by making Pennsylvania something like an immigration detention hub. We're seeing that a couple of weeks ago, commissioners in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, which is a very rural and a very isolated area of Pennsylvania, they approved an agreement for Moshannon Valley Correctional Center to serve as a dedicated immigration detention center. We also know that it's the GEO Group who will operate the facility. And of course, this flies in the face of community efforts and to end immigrant detention. What we know about this facility is that it will have capacity for approximately 1,800 people, so it's massive. But they say that they're going to start with 800, which is still a massive number. Moshannon Valley used to be a Bureau of Prisons jail with, again, a deeply problematic history of abuse, things like lack of access to phones and visitation, including legal visitation, limited food given to detainees, overcrowding, and also problematic retaliation against people who spoke out about the conditions at the facility. And the promise to the local community of Clearfield County is that they're going to get their jobs back when they lost their jobs when Moshannon Valley had closed in early 2020. These are the same guards and these are the same people that committed abuses in the past. They're trained for criminal detention and they're now going to be overseeing civil detention operation by a private for-profit corporation. So it's truly disconcerting.
An area where Aldea has worked pretty relentlessly and effectively has been to end family detention and successfully move the administration previously to release all families from Burke's Detention Center. Despite this positive step, we've heard recently that the administration is ramping up plans to reopen Burke's and begin detaining immigrant women with plans to hold over 100 women in Burke's. So can you give us some more insight on what you're hearing and seeing at Burke's and why reopening this facility that's been pretty roundly condemned would be so troublesome?
Well, fortunately, thankfully, we haven't seen anything at Burke's just yet. But we think it's pretty imminent. What we know is that they will be bringing in women who are low priorities for this administration anyway. Recent entrants from the southern border, of course, but we have no idea exactly who they are in terms of their legal procedural posture. We don't know if they're going to hold them just to process them or whatever that means, or if it will be like York, where people will remain detained through the entirety of their proceedings, which is truly frightening for us as legal service providers and one of the few legal service providers in the area. And it's problematic because I'm saying problematic a lot because there are really a lot of problems here. But let's recall the Burke's history of medical neglect, of terrible food, of punitive measures against the moms who spoke out about the problems that they were having there. And of course, the rape that occurred there several years back. So truly it is dangerous and again, problematic for women to be brought to this place. And as a matter of fact, earlier today, we found out that while the immediate plan is to bring only women, what the county and ICE have been discussing is the possibility of also including men at this facility. So instead of diminishing, instead of reducing the reliance on detention, what we are seeing is that it's truly just expanding.
Very troubling and difficult to hear and concerning. So Adriana, what can the people on this call do to help?
So that's a great question. I think in the years that I've been an advocate at Burke's, I don't get tired of saying this, and it's we need lawyers. We need help. We will need help. Before we used to deal with families and we would have like 30 or 40 families at a time. Now we're going to have 100 or more individual cases. So our work is going to be doubling or tripling. It's really frightening. So what we did before is we had a universal representation model through which we were able to provide an attorney for every family that was detained there. And that's what we would like to do if in fact truly if in fact Berks opens up again. So to that end, we're coming up with volunteer teams of attorneys, law students, advocates, interpreters, anybody who has a skill that thinks may be useful to represent the women that will be at Berks. We've created, or we are in the process of creating what we call WMDs, a Women's Migrant Defense Project. I'm gonna very quickly on the chat. I think we have a chat. Yes, I think I'm gonna drop the link to our volunteer form. I will do it in a second, actually, because I will have to look for it. To our volunteer form for anybody who may be interested in volunteering their skills at Berks to please join us. It can be done remotely. We have done this before. We can do it again. We can keep on fighting back, and we just need your help.
Thank you, Adriana. So I next want to bring in Jane Liu, our senior litigation attorney at the Young Center. Jane has litigated public interest and civil rights cases for more than a decade. Prior to joining the Young Center, Jane was the legal director at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, where she led legal advocacy and litigation strategies to advance the rights of Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls in the areas of reproductive rights, health, economic justice, and immigration rights. Jane was previously a partner at a Washington, D.C. public interest law firm where she litigated public interest and civil rights cases. She began her career as a public defender in Boston. She received her JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and her undergraduate degree from Princeton. So Jane, we've heard some of these concerns on the ground as a consequence of the Biden administration's policy choices. There's also ongoing litigation on many of these fronts. So I was hoping that you could give us the current lay of the land. And could we start with litigation concerning Title 42?
Sure. I think it's helpful to, there's a lot of litigation going on around Title 42 right now. It's helpful to think of it as 3 different lawsuits that are that we're all watching very closely. The first one was a lawsuit that was brought to challenge Title 42 as it applied to unaccompanied children. That litigation was led by the ACLU and other advocacy groups. And the district court judge in that case ruled that Title 42 as it applied to unaccompanied children was illegal and issued an injunction basically blocking the Trump administration from using Title 42 against unaccompanied children. The Trump administration appealed and it went up to the Court of Appeals, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, unfortunately, granted a stay to the Trump administration, meaning that the injunction was stopped while the appeal was pending. Then the Biden administration took over, and fortunately, they formally accepted unaccompanied children from Title 42, meaning that Title 42 would not be used against unaccompanied children. So under the Biden administration, unaccompanied children have not been expelled under Title 42. Then there's another lawsuit that was brought to challenge Title 42 as it applies to families, and that was also brought by ACLU and advocacy groups. And in that case, fairly recently, the district court judge again ruled that Title 42 is illegal as it applies to families, and again issued an injunction barring Title 42 from being used against families. And again, unfortunately, the DC Circuit has issued a stay against that injunction while an appeal is pending. And the unfortunate thing is that the Biden administration has stuck by Title 42 and has continued to apply it against families and single adults and has appealed the district court's ruling in that case, and that appeal is pending. To make matters even more complicated, the state of Texas has challenged the Biden administration's decision to accept unaccompanied children from Title 42. And that case is moving along. The state of Texas is essentially seeking an injunction ordering the Biden administration to apply Title 42 against unaccompanied children. That motion is pending in a district court in Texas, and very likely the district court in Texas is going to rule on that in the next couple of months or so. So all of that is to say, the bottom line is that right now, unaccompanied children are accepted under Title 42, but we have serious concerns that a district court in Texas could undo that. And in the meantime, families continue to be expelled under Title 42, and single adults, there has been no challenge to that, and single adults continue to be expelled under Title 42 as well. So that's the lay of the land on Title 42.
So another area, or I'd say a different issue point where the administration did listen to advocates has been the unwinding and ending of the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico policy. Just as a bit of background for those on the call, Remain in Mexico was a policy that was created by the Trump administration in 2019. That's obviously before the pandemic. NPP allowed people to seek protection in the United States, but it forced them to wait in Mexico for proceedings that took place in hastily created tent courts on the US side of the border. There were tens of thousands of families that were trapped in Mexico because of NPP. The Biden administration ended the policy within days of taking office, but immediately afterwards, the states of Texas and Missouri filed lawsuits to try and force the administration to reinstitute the policy. So Jane, if you could you tell us where we stand with NPP and what the Biden administration should be doing to ensure that this policy doesn't once again place children and families in harm's way?
Sure. So as you just said, Texas and Missouri sued to challenge the Biden administration's decision to end NPP or the Remain in Mexico policy. And unfortunately, the district court judge in that case ruled for Texas and Missouri and or issued an injunction ordering the Biden administration to reinstate NPP. The Biden administration appealed and sought a stay, basically asking that they not have to reinstate NPP while an appeal is pending. But unfortunately, the Fifth Circuit, the Court of Appeals, as well as the Supreme Court, both denied the stay. So as it stands right now, the Biden administration is appealing the district court's decision, but they are required to comply with the injunction, which requires them to make good faith efforts to reinstate NPP. That is very disappointing, deeply concerning for us. The Biden administration has already filed documents with the court indicating the efforts that it's made to reinstate and to, I guess, sort of ramp things up to start NPP again, including, creating soft side structures for tent court hearings and things like that, and negotiating with Mexico, which is necessary in order for them to reinstate NPP. So that's unfortunately the state of things with Remain in Mexico. We are very concerned. I mean, I think that there are some reports that NPP could start up within the next couple of months, and that's deeply concerning given the tremendous harm to kids and families and anyone that was subjected to NPP previously and are still being harmed by NPP even now. So, I mean, I think we're at this point, we're calling the Biden administration to do everything it can to not, to end MPP, to not restart it, and to end it. Obviously, they're pursuing their appeal. There are one of the grounds of that lawsuit was that the Biden administration didn't give enough written justification for ending MPP. So a lot of advocates and legal scholars have been calling for the Biden administration to immediately issue a new memo giving much more detailed reasons why they should end MPP. So that's one thing that the Biden administration could consider doing. The other thing is that the Biden administration, even as it's considering reinstating MPP, really needs to consider, they're not, they could do it in a very different way, and take the time to think about how to ensure, that, children and families and people aren't harmed and their due process rights aren't denied. And, that won't be done in a couple of months. They would need to, and soft-sided structures would not do it either. So I think that that's just something that they can keep in mind. But obviously, at the end of the day, we just want MPP to end and by the Biden administration to do anything within its power to not reinstate MPP.
So Jane, we've also seen some other egregiously anti-immigrant action from state actors, including from the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. So how does this state action complicate matters for the administration? And again, what steps should they be taking to mitigate harm?
Well, I mean, I think, as a lot of people are aware, Governor Abbott in Texas has taken numerous actions that really target immigrants, criminalizing them, arresting them for trespass, for crossing between points of entry. Recently, Governor Abbott also delicensed facilities in Texas that provide residential care to unaccompanied children. Governor Abbott also attempted to issue an order directing state police to stop any vehicle that they have a reasonable suspicion of transporting migrants who have crossed the border between points of entry. That order was fortunately enjoined, but all of these are attacks on immigrants. And I think that, what the Biden administration really needs to do is just wholesale criticize these actions and condemn them and not cooperate or support them in any way. Like for instance, with the arrests of migrants, we're really disappointed that, even though, that's not something that the Biden administration is responsible for. It's Governor Abbott that's arresting migrants. Immigration detainers are being placed on migrants, which means that after they're being arrested and their cases are adjudicated or dismissed, they're going to ICE on detainers. And we are urging the Biden administration not to cooperate with, Abbott's order criminalizing migrants. They should not be supporting or in any way complicit in that type of, action. So I think that that's something that the Biden administration could do to make clear that, actions targeting immigrants in these xenophobic and racist ways are not acceptable, and the Biden administration won't support those types of actions.
And then a final question, Jane. So during this conversation, we've touched on a number of topics. Could you briefly just share some concrete steps that the administration should take to ensure that the actions of the administration align with the promises that they've made to modernize our immigration system, and again, reassert our commitment to asylum seekers and refugees?
I mean, I think that, when we look at all these border policies, and we haven't even talked about the universe of all the border policies that are, harming immigrants at the border. I mean, I think that what's most important is to look at the solutions together, because the impact of these policies are all happening together, that you can't separate NPP, from Title 42, from state actions that are targeting migrants, from metering and all the things that are impacting migrants. And so really what the Biden administration needs to do is, rather than take a whole, take this kind of piecemeal, accepting one group versus another, or, doing a little bit, but not like fully coming out and saying like, we welcome migrants, and, these asylum seekers, have the right to seek protection in our country. I think that that's the approach that the Biden administration promised when they took office, and I don't think that they really lived up to those values. So, I can't begin to say it like that. The first step needs to be to end Title 42. It just needs to be ended against all groups, and for the Biden administration, it's really important for them to understand that, the impact of, Title 42 and expelling groups of people, will always come to harm children. And it is not sufficient to just accept unaccompanied children from Title 42. They need to end Title 42 for all groups, because the harm to all migrants is deep, and they just need to, open our points of entry again. Our borders need to open again. So I don't know if that's, like a concrete solution, but that's, that's a first step. And I think that they really need to, the Biden administration also needs to be very transparent and public about its objection to state actions that are targeting migrants. So.
Thank you, Jane. And our next, I'd like to turn to our last speaker, Olivia Pena. Olivia is the co-director of the Young Center's Child Advocate Program, where she helps lead a passionate and zealous team of attorneys and social workers fighting for the rights and best interests of immigrant children. She's lived most of her life along the US-Mexico border and witnessed firsthand the issues and inequities impacting border communities. Olivia earned her JD at the University of Houston Law and her BS from the University of Texas at Brownsville and Texas Southmost College. And she works out of our office on the border in Harlingen, Texas. So Olivia, thank you for joining us. When you speak with children and families arriving at the border, what are they telling you about why they left their home countries, and what challenges do they experience on their journey to the US border?
Yes, that's a great question, Robert, and thank you so much for having me. And I really, before I join into the conversation, I want to make sure that we give a shout out to the Angry Tias. They were trying their best to make it possible for them to be here today. As you can expect, living on the border and with all the situation that's going on down here and all the needs that are, constantly ongoing, there were various hardships that couldn't allow them to be here with us today. But I mean, that just goes to show to all the work that all the multiple NGOs along the border are having to do. So I want to make sure that we honor how much work they do, and make sure that we know and let them know that we appreciate them. And fortunately, they weren't here today. So I'm going to do my best to do an account of all the work that is going down at the border and of what we're seeing, right? Because going back to your question, Robert, what we are seeing is essentially a replication of what was happening, in 2018 in the Matamoros camp, right? Like we're seeing that coming up again in Reynosa, right? We have hundreds, thousands of people who don't have a safe place to sleep. We are seeing children there without their loved ones, facing really difficult decisions about finding a safe place and or staying together. And so one of the things that we constantly hear from parents and children is like, you're fleeing for multiple reasons, right? Whether it's a natural disaster or violence or, just lack of government protection. There's many reasons why they're departing. And then, this whole situation at the border just makes it a lot more hard for them to be able to achieve that safety that they deserve, right? And that they need, and that they've been searching for some of them for years, right? Some of them might be on this journey, not just recently, but it could be ongoing for years, and they've already faced a lot of hardships. They've survived so many traumas. And so oftentimes what we hear from children is, those really difficult journeys, the different situations of potential trafficking, kidnapping, living in fear, living under a tent. And again, shout out to all the organizations and nonprofits that come together and meet those needs at the border, whether it's in Matamoros or Reynosa or Del Rio, there's always that united, unity amongst the NGOs coming together to really meet those needs of those families and those children. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. So, I don't know if I really answered your question, but I want to make sure that I recognize them and recognize all the hardships that families are going through right now at the border.
Well, that was great. And, thank you for acknowledging all the important work that our groups do on the border. And so you touched on it a bit, but, could you describe, how much have things changed, if all, now under the Biden administration at the border for children and families, looking in comparison to how things were under the previous administration?
That's like a sigh. That's like the first thing that comes to my, this is the first initial reaction that I have. It's obviously, we were all really excited and hopeful about the fact that we had a change in the administration, and, having lived through 4 years of constant, never knowing what to expect, but always knowing that it wasn't going to be something that was very pro, migrants and in a very, something that wasn't going to be humane, right? We were just waiting for that, blow. So there was a sense of relief once there was a change in the administration, and there was a sense of hope. And there was an appreciation for having the NGOs, having us at the table, being able for us to share our experience. But slowly but surely, we're seeing there isn't that much of a change, right? Some of the things that we are seeing are things that we were seeing back in 2018, right? Struggles with people being able to enter the United States, the mechanisms just being extra hard and taking a lot of work from multiple people, whether it's NGOs, attorneys, private attorneys, the people themselves, right, having to navigate really complex systems that were supposed to make things easier, but really they're just the same. It's the same system that was in place not too long ago. Think about it, Title 42, right? It's still there. We honestly believe that people can continue entering the country, and that mechanisms can still be in place for us to make sure that there's, not a medical unsafety, or as they claim, a unsafe situation as it relates to the pandemic. And there's a lot of reports and data out there saying, that migrants are not the cause of the spread of the pandemic, right? There's a lot of other factors from people that are within the country that are causing the pandemic to spread. So it's not necessarily attributed to the migrants. And I can attest to the fact that, the organization on the ground, figure out how to get COVID testing, how to figure how to help people quarantine, how to make sure that they do all that is needed in order for migrants to enter in a way that is still safe for the communities that they're coming into. And so Title 42, I agree with Jane that it has to go. It's not a humane policy. MPP, there's a process, by which they can, get rid of it. The administration has the power and ability to get rid of MPP, and we should be able to do that. Because again, we're going back to 2018 when we heard of a lot of parents frantically trying to figure out how to stay safe, how to live under, really extreme circumstances, unsafe circumstances, and children trying to come in and not being able to come in. Metering is still something that is a situation happening at the border. Children needing to have this whole team of advocates in order to just seek safety and seek asylum, which we know is a right, and it's legal. So honestly, that was like a really long answer to essentially say, I don't think that there much has changed. And now without, other mechanisms that would allow for people to come in, like, the consortium process and the WISHA process, we're back to like where we were, 2018 with the other administration. And so just thinking through like, how are we going to make sure that people get the services and the safety they need with all of these limitations that we all thought wouldn't be in place once we got a change in the administration. So.
And one last question for you, Olivia. So obviously one of the most troubling aspects of the Trump administration was the intentional separation of families as a deterrent to migration. While we haven't quite seen the Biden administration set out to intentionally separate families in the same deliberate fashion, we've certainly heard stories of families who are forced to separate at the border so that children can be processed under Title 42, while certainly obviously family units and adults are expelled at the border. So have you seen these cases of forced separation as a result of Title 42 and the impact it's having on families?
Let me make sure I mute myself. And yes, while it's not as deliberate and as, very explicit, the malice and the intention behind it, it's still forced separation, right? You're leaving people with no other choice but to decide, okay, do I stay in this camp without, housing, without food, without medication, without, safety, right? Because you're out in the open. So I can't imagine having to live in a park with my, relatives, or much less my 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and being exposed in that manner. I think as a parent, it's understandable that they want to place them in the best situation possible. That's the whole reason why they went through this whole journey. And children as well, like, it might be very hard for them to understand why there's this, forced separation happening. And what happens is they make this really difficult choice. They figure out a system which honestly shouldn't be this difficult, right? Children shouldn't be having to cross through, around the ports of entries, right? It's a dangerous crossing. They should be able to present themselves and seek safety, ideally with their families, but if not, just by the fact that they're children. So what we're seeing is when the children were coming across and entering, the facilities where they're being cared for while they reunify with another relative in the US, it's like the idea of like, okay, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? And then the parents in other places, wondering like, where's my child? How can I establish communication with the limited resources that they had? So oftentimes it was like, I don't have a phone. I don't know. I can't charge it. And then the children wondering like, well, where's my mom? What's happening to her? And then, making sure that people understood, the sort of the implications of this separation, right? Like it wasn't because a parent didn't love a child that's why they sent them across. It was particularly because they love their child and they want them to be safe. And it's not because they can't, try to keep them safe, but some things are out of their control, right? Like when you're being targeted, there's only so much you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones. And so the only alternative is separating in hopes that they're going to get to a safe place, and then later you reunify. And I think that uncertainty, the fear of like, okay, how much longer is it going to be for me to get my child back? Are they going to go into a place where I'm never going to have access to them? We hear that often from both the parents and the children, like, okay, what happens next? I just want to be with my family. I just want to be with my parents. I'm afraid for them too, like, right? The parent is afraid for the child being in an unknown space. And then the child is afraid for the parent, like having gone through the unsafe conditions in the camps in Matamoros or Reynosa or in Mexico in general, right? Because it's not just limited to Reynosa. There's people all across Mexico, trying to seek safety in the US.
So, so hard to hear, so frustrating. But thank you, Olivia, for sharing. So before we get to our question and answer section of the webinar, I just wanted to hopefully leave leave with a positive note, or at least action for people after the webinar. So these are some recommendations for individuals and organizations that you can use to push back and hopefully push back on these policies. So the first is raise your concerns about what you've heard here today. Raise your concerns about the treatment of immigrant families. Call on the Biden administration to end Title 42. Let those in power know that this isn't in line with our values. It's not in line with what the Biden administration has previously promised. And it's obviously and certainly not in line with our laws. Tell your elected representative that these policies further longstanding racism and xenophobia against people of color, and particularly against Black immigrants. Obviously a recent example of this is the abhorrent treatment of Haitian asylum seekers at the border. We also clearly and steadfastly believe that and recommend that people be allowed to seek their legal right to asylum with their families at our border and in compliance with our laws, that we bolster funding for case management and access to counsel for children and families instead of building a system that's based in detention. We need to ensure that children are welcomed at the border by trained individuals who work with children and not law enforcement agencies. And we need to bring the health and human services and their officers to the border to receive families and children in a humane fashion rather than, again, through law enforcement. And we need to keep children with their families, even non-parent relatives who can be screened for safety. And lastly, we need to welcome Haitians and afford them with the right to apply for asylum and reorient our policy, the United States policy, towards a meaningful investment in Haiti's development. So with that, we promise some time for questions. So we have some in the chat. You can enter them in the chat. We can have our, let's see, okay, we have the first question, and speakers, please feel free to answer. The first question, do you have any idea how many kids have endured forced separation as a result of Title 42 policies?
I think I can take that question, Robert. This is Olivia with the Young Center. And it's really hard for me to attribute like a number. I do want to say that one is more than it should, right? Like one is too many. But as we've come across, we've seen a good percentage of, it's really hard for me to attribute a number, but we've seen, in the span of, the last couple months, maybe a good, at least just in the population that we serve, and that is not all of the children, like a 15 to 20% of those children that we see have experienced, either MPP or Title 42.
And I just wanted to add that one of the problems is that information is not being tracked by the administration in a meaningful way. And so we would love to have that data, but often, that's not seen as like a family separation if a family member is Title 42 and then the child enters the UC system. It's often not tracked as a family separation, and that's part of the problem. So.
Next question. Do you know of organizations that need French-speaking law students to help with the Haitian refugee crisis? Unfortunately, the question also says this person does not speak Haitian Creole, but many Haitians know French. Just offhand, I can think of Baji, the Black Alliance for Immigrants, Haitian Bridge Alliance as well. Someone mentioned that in the chat. Still taking questions. If anyone has them, please feel free to ask. Question just came in. Is there a possibility high school students that speak multiple languages can fill out a volunteer form, or is there another way we can help?
I'm going to assume that that was the volunteer form that I just that I put in the chat. Absolutely, we need interpreters in many languages. I have my little cousin who's, well, not that little, she just graduated high school and she's an interpreter for us. Absolutely, please sign up. Thank you.
Yes, and from the Young Centers, and we do have some very specific requirements for you to be a volunteer with the Young Center in our Child Advocate program. But there are other ways that high school students can work with us and serve the children, and it is by being a Young Center ambassador. And there's definitely more information on the youngcenter.org regarding what our ambassador program is. And then, of course, other ways that people, from all parts and all ages can help is just by raising awareness about the work that we do at the Young Center and about the work that all of these organizations, some of which have been mentioned in the chat, and the other ones, like the ones at the border, just raising awareness of everything that is going on as it relates to immigration, the needs, and the different types of support that they can provide. But for the Young Center purposes, if you're 21 and over, become a child advocate. If you're under the age of 21, become a Young Center ambassador.
We have another question, again, for the group. What is the most important thing advocates can help with right now? Anyone feel free to answer that one.
Again, from our perspective, is just raising awareness, having conversations with, your members of Congress, holding people accountable to what is happening at the border, and making sure that if it's within your ability to help, whether it is by, being a volunteer, showing up in those spaces, whether it's translating or going, to the border, or, whatever it is that you have within your capacity, or donating to the organizations doing the work. I think first and foremost, raise awareness, learn, and then find ways to take action and help.
This one I'll ask to Jane. This is a question in the chat. It says, I thought that unaccompanied children were only allowed to stay in detention centers for a certain number of days. However, it seems like many stay for a longer period. Could you please comment?
Sure. So if we're talking about unaccompanied children, under the law, they're only supposed to be in ICE detention or CBP custody for 72 hours before they're transferred to an ORR, or the Office of Refugee Resettlement Shelter, so a government shelter for unaccompanied kids. Because of, I guess because of the increase in the number of kids coming in, the Biden administration started a new type of facility called an emergency intake site. And so kids are being held there for long periods of time, but then they're also being held at these shelters for long periods of time. So they are supposed to be released as soon as possible. And we always advocate for release because it's not appropriate for a child to be held in detention. If there's family members able to receive them or a sponsor, but kids have been held in custody for months and days, and it really depends on each child's case. But we have been very concerned about kids being held in these emergency intake sites for weeks, maybe even months, without any action being done to reunite them with family members and sponsors. So.
We have another question. What would you say to an American who is concerned about Latin American asylum seekers possibly introducing a dangerous new COVID variant? This can go to Jane or Olivia, really anyone who'd like to answer.
I think that I will say this because I don't want to go too much into detail on this issue, but there are a lot of materials out there by medical experts and doctors that have condemned the public health reasoning behind Title 42. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the Title 42 has been, I guess, the reasoning behind it has been, the issue of COVID, and yet, the policies that the government has had for other types of travel has not been consistent with this concern about the spread of COVID. For instance, other visitors and visa holders are able to travel through our borders without any issue, and are not expelled or are not prevented from coming in. And so it's not been consistent. And I think that that's part of the reasoning that, even the judges pointed out in terms of, the government's concerns about COVID spread are not consistent with its other policies regarding other types of travel. Really, they've targeted undocumented migrants and really no other travelers in this type of way. So.
Next question we have is, how can we contact the Biden administration about Title 42? I can take this one. One of the leading campaigns on the issue is the Welcome with Dignity campaign. We'll share a link in the chat. They have many resources and great direction on the matter. As we've mentioned previously, not only contacting the administration, but contact with your local representatives, elected officials can be an important step. Obviously, Title 42 is a mandate from the CDC and the Biden administration, but certainly congressional pressure can't hurt. And we now have a link in the chat. We're nearing the end of our webinar, but I do want to give us some time if we have any more questions. We have another one here. How can we approach the UN Human Rights Affinity Group with this information? What can the UN Human Rights Group do to help?
I will say that that UNHCR has pretty much, repeatedly condemned Title 42. So I think that we just need to keep doing what they're doing, which is, condemning Title 42, condemning NPP, condemning inhumane policies at the border. And I think in some ways, these policies are such a clear violation of international human rights standards. So really the the Biden administration needs to just uphold those values. So I don't know if there's anything that you can do other than, and I can't emphasize enough, like, call your Congress people, even if they already condemn Title 42, just support that decision. And for those in the border states, your voice needs to be heard for migrants and for immigrant children, like, especially with the attacks that are going on against migrants, your voice really matters. And I really encourage you to contact your Congress people and also your local representatives as well. So.
Okay, well, I think that's the last one we'll be able to get to. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Any questions we weren't able to respond to, we'll follow up with an email. We'll also post a video of this conversation. Also want to thank Jane, Adriana, and Olivia for speaking today, and thank everyone for coming. So thanks.